Madam President, I ask that the statement I'm about to make be placed in a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, it's good to be back. I was gone last week, fighting off my second round of COVID. It was not serious, thank goodness. Good medical care, and my wife had shown a great deal of patience. My sticking around the house for too many days. But I'm glad to be back, and I want to say a word about the issue that is pending on the floor of the Senate, because it's meant a lot to me throughout my congressional career. Madam President, it was just over 20 years ago in this chamber that Congress voted to authorize the use of military force against Iraq. I remember that vote as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was little more than a year after the vicious terrorist attacks of 9/11. Our nation still felt deeply about what had happened to 3,000 innocent Americans. All evidence pointed to Afghanistan-based al-Qaeda as the culprit in that horrific 9/11 attack. Yet within days of 9/11, some in Washington decided to beat a different drum, not against al-Qaeda or Afghanistan, but against Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein. Then Vice President Cheney warned repeatedly that Hussein was actively pursuing weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. The Vice President was adamant. He said there was no doubt, his words, no doubt, Hussein was amassing them to use against the United States. Former Pentagon advisor Richard Pearl argued preposterously that Iraqis could finance their nation's post-war rebuilding from its oil wealth, and said he had no doubt that they would. And then President George W. Bush, who claimed the war was his last choice, provocatively tried to link al-Qaeda with Saddam Hussein, a dubious claim that was naturally echoed by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld even tried to claim a war in Iraq would last, listen to this, quote, 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months, but it certainly isn't going to last any longer than that, said the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Then Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and Vice President Cheney insist that Iraqis would be welcoming the United States military as, quote, liberators. When asked about reports that a war with Iraq would require hundreds of thousands of American troops, Wolfowitz casually dismissed the warning as, quote, way off the mark. The American people were summarily deceived and misled by the political leaders in Washington. Then came the war. It didn't last weeks as we were promised. It lasted for most of the next decade. More than 150,000 American troops have served in Iraq. No nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction were ever found. We were never greeted as liberators. Iraqi oil didn't pay for the damage, the $2 trillion cost of the war. American taxpayers paid for it. More than 4,500 U.S. service members died in that conflict in Iraq. Another 32,000 were wounded, many of them grievously. My colleague in the Senate, Tammy Duckworth, is one of those who was seriously injured. It's what brought her to my attention when I invited her to speak or to listen to a State of the Union address, and her heroism brought her to my attention politically. I'm honored that she serves with me here in the Senate. Countless Iraqi civilians lost their lives in the ensuing civil war that erupted after Saddam Hussein was toppled. I had voted 1 year before the beginning of the Iraq War to support the use of military force in Afghanistan. It made sense. They generated al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda generated 9/11. It was time for us to answer. That is where those who masterminded the 9/11 attacks were located. But I was never convinced our sons and daughters should be sent to war in Iraq. That's why I was one of 23 senators, 1 Republican and 22 Democrats, who voted against the 2002 Iraq authorization for use of military force, known as the AUMF. History has shown that my concern and misgivings, along with my colleagues, 23 of us, were tragically correct. I doubt few here in Washington at the time could have imagined that this AUMF would still be referred to and referenced for U.S. military action over 20 years later. Even more incredibly, the 1991 Gulf War AUMF that was supposed to expel Iraq from Kuwait is still in effect more than 30 years later. To allow such resolutions to remain in effect decades after the wars they authorized is more than just a clerical oversight. It's a threat to our national security. It's an open-ended invitation for conflict. That is why today's action, repealing these two AUMFs, is long overdue. I want to thank my colleagues on a bipartisan basis, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, Senator Young of Indiana, for leading the effort. I'm honored to co-sponsor it. In the end, the debate before us isn't about whether Iraq posed a threat to Kuwait in 1991 or to the U.S. in 2001. It is not even about the ultimate merits of those conflicts. This long overdue debate in the Senate floor this week is instead about Congress's responsibility when it comes to war and about the use of open-ended authorizations to send military forces. Our Constitution is clear on one question. Many others too, but certainly on one question. Article 1, Section 8 says, the power to declare war is an explicit power of Congress. The Founding Fathers got that right as far as I'm concerned. We should never send our sons and daughters, or anyone's sons and daughters, into a war without the consent of the American people through Congress. Our Founding Fathers were wise in making use of this awesome power of declaration of war. Didn't rest in the hands of a monarch or even a president by himself, but with the people's elected representatives. I've made this same argument in the House and the Senate, regardless of who was president, a Democrat or a Republican, whether it was President Bush in Iraq or President Obama in Syria or Libya. We should not leave these Iraq AUMFs or any authorizations like them in force in perpetuity. Doing so allows too much room for unforeseen consequences and too great of a chance that the authorizations will be stretched beyond their original intent. It makes the possibility of going to war just too easy. It creates a dangerous disconnect between the people's elected representatives and one of the most solemn decisions of democratic self-government. And if some AUMFs, like the one used to respond to the al-Qaeda attack on the United States, which I supported, need updating, we also need to meet that responsibility here in Congress. Let me be clear, nothing we're doing here prevents an American president from acting in self-defense or in the face of imminent threats to our American nation. Repealing these AUMFs doesn't preclude Congress from debating and possibly passing another AUMF to address future threats. But repealing these outdated authorizations for the use of force will help make sure that such AUMFs are not used for other possible wars without explicit congressional approval. Repealing these AUMFs will close open-ended war authorizations that should be revisited and debated by Congress as required by the Constitution. So I strongly support the legislation before us to repeal these authorizations and to ensure that future AUMFs are not allowed to remain in place. I plan on reintroducing my legislation that sunsets any AUMF after 10 years. If the continued use of military force is justified beyond a decade, Congress should do it expressly by vote and debate so the American people can be witness to this decision and part of it. We should no longer abdicate our responsibility by relying on a resolution that has long since served its intended purpose. Madam President, I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.